Can you see the title screen now?
Yes, that looks good.
Sweet. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. Um, okay, yeah. So I just want to outline the current state of our oceans, which is a bit doom and gloom, unfortunately. But honestly, the presentation is not going to be this theme the whole way. So a lot of you might have seen a few of these graphics on the screen. We've got the iconic global temperature bars um, showing how our planet's heated up since 1850. And then the kind of wiggly line at the bottom is our current sea surface temperatures. And so it's a little bit outdated. I can't find a 2025, but the 2024 is the red line at the top here. And so you can see that we're definitely getting hotter and hotter sea surface temperatures year on year. And so all this information is kind of assessed by organizations globally at different tiers. You've got organizations like UNESCO, the FAO, which is like the Fisheries and Agriculture Organization, the ISA, which is the International Seabed Authority, and then UNCLOS as well. And then underneath them, all this information that provides the data that we're looking at today is done by scientific community, scientific organizations and monitoring networks. So you've got the IPCC, NOAA, which is the American governing body. You've got IMOS, which is here in Australia, and then you've got EDMODnet in Europe. And then those organizations are fed all of the raw information on the state of our oceans by NGOs and by academia. So like people like myself, all the data I collect goes into these bigger organizations. So, for example, the data I collect goes into IMOS for Australia, and it's open access. It means that anyone can access the data that we're looking at. And then you have organizations like WWF, Greenpeace, Oceans International, and then you've got some really famous centers globally, like Scripps in California and KAUST in the Middle East. And so collectively, all of these bodies kind of supply the information that lets us understand what's happening with our oceans globally. And so I'm sure we're all aware of some of the big issues that are happening in our oceans right now. Climate change is one of the biggest things that is discussed. As I said previously, sea surface temperatures just continue to rise, and that has a lot of impact to both flora and fauna within our oceans. We're having marine heat waves more frequently, which is impacting things like the coral, which are bleaching year on year. We're losing our ice mass in the polar regions, which is increasing sea level. And by 2100, there'll be a lot of catastrophic, irreversible damage done to a lot of our coastal communities around the world. We're losing biodiversity quicker than anything. Overfishing is a massive problem. The image in the bottom right is the size of a super trawler net. And there's a number of these in our oceans at any one time. And these do not discriminate. They just catch anything that falls into it. And so a high percentage of fishing catch is bycatch, which is generally tossed overboard. A lot of these methodologies create destruction of habitats, which is impacting our species diversity. Because we now have increasing sea surface temperatures, we have a global network of ships that freely move through our oceans. Invasive species is becoming a big problem here in Australia and globally. And all of this also creates depletion of oxygen in our oceans. Pollution, plastics, agriculture, noise, all big issues to our ocean. Plastics is an obvious one. Agriculture is things like runoff from factory farming that goes into our rivers, estuaries, and then out to sea. Or it could just be increase in nutrients due to weather conditions or sewage, whatever it may be. And then noise. Our oceans have gotten louder and louder as years have gone on. And it's becoming a problem for animals like whales and dolphins who, use sound to communicate, to navigate. And then one of the biggest issues is there's a lack of governance and protection from industry and from government. So about 8% of our oceans are marine protected areas. Marine protected areas doesn't mean that our oceans are safe. It just means that there's legislation in those specific parts of the ocean, um, which makes it a little bit harder to do some things. But destruction can still happen. So, for example, bottom trawling can still take place in a marine protected area. It just means that there's permits and all this other stuff that needs to be achieved first. And so one thing that's tackling this with all these big issues is the UN High Seas Treaty. This is a global movement where countries sign to say that they're going to protect 30% of our oceans by 2030. And it comes in two stages. Last year or the year before, the UN created the High Seas Treaty, which means that it's accepted by countries. And what needs to happen now is the ratification of this. So every country that agreed to be part of the UN High Seas Treaty needs to physically sign the document to start the clock to say that they'll protect 30% of their waters by 2030. So for context, Australia has said they're going to be part of the High Seas Treaty, but they haven't ratified it yet, which means that the clock hasn't started for Australia. They're not taking action yet. And so one of the big issues here in Australia is obviously the shark killing in Queensland and New South Wales. So just for context, Queensland have been culling sharks since the 1960s. New South Wales have been culling sharks since the 1930s. So these practices are very, very outdated. They're labeled as bather protection programs. It's kind of put forward that all of this is to protect beach users and water users, but effectively, what this is a method of fishing. And these practices haven't really changed much since the 30s and the 60s. It's very outdated. A few of these images on the screen here, we have the shark nets just here. New South Wales and Queensland are very different. One of them sits 4 meters from the surface on the seabed, whereas the other one is at the surface and just goes down a few meters and doesn't cover the entire beach. This is just a floating fishing net, which entraps whales, dolphins, turtles, basically anything that catches in it. New South Wales, in all fairness, have improved their technology, but they haven't really stopped their culling efforts. So this big diagram on the right-hand side is New South Wales's shark management program. So what they use now is they use drones, which is a non-lethal method of observations. They still use drum lines, which is this thing down here. It's basically just a baited hook which floats in the ocean, and anything that snags on it is caught. But unlike Queensland, New South Wales have got what they call smart drum lines, which means they're fitted with these sensors that as soon as it detects something on a drum line, a notification is sent to the monitoring people on land, and they're supposed to go out and release that animal, whether it's a shark or a dolphin or a fish or whatever it is. Generally, they'll tag the shark as well. But studies have shown that, sometimes these responses are really delayed, and by the time they get there, the shark or the animal has passed away. Obviously, there's a Shark Smart app which feeds into this listening devices, this new technology. So you can actually get alerts on your phone if sharks have been sighted in the area. But ultimately, it's an archaic, outdated practice. Queensland have a species list. This is just their list of sharks that is on their target species, but there's no way of defining between target and non-target. Like I said, these devices catch absolutely anything that falls in their way. Also, they don't take into consideration that sharks are migratory species. Australia just having its little collection of sharks that stay in Australian waters. A recent study found that a great white shark originated in South Africa and made its way all the way to Indonesia. So, these are animals that swim great distances. There's no way of controlling shark or managing sharks in Australia, just by the nature of how they are. But you'll be pleased to know that over the years, there has been so much pushback against the shark culling in Queensland and New South Wales. There's been multiple publications, and these just a few that I found online. There's a lot of studies into public perception around sharks and shark mitigation practices. Um, Thankfully, a lot of people in Australia are against shark culling. Um, they are in favor of non-lethal methodologies, so like the drones. There have been some studies out of South Africa where they use barriers that look like kelp, and it deters sharks. You've got the magnets that can be used to repel sharks. Um, there's loads of things out there which are non-lethal methodologies, but unfortunately, New South Wales and Queensland, or Australia in general, are still pushing this bather protection program. Um, in fact, Queensland have just increased their efforts and ramped up their culling efforts in Queensland, which is shocking because there's been a lot of pushback against it. It's not just Australia who have culled sharks in the past. There was shark culling in Hawaii and in South Africa, and both Hawaii and South Africa stopped culling sharks because they realized that that was not a way to manage shark-human interactions. The paper in the bottom right-hand side was actually published in 1997. And even back then, South Africa acknowledged that shark culling, shark nets, all this kind of stuff just wasn't the right thing to do. And just wasn't mitigating anything. And so they paused it. But also there's been a lot of pushback from the public. There's been a lot of documentaries like the Envoy Shark Cull documentary. There's the protests that happen. But unfortunately, it's a constant battle because the narrative between the media and the public is what stirs a lot of this. The language that they use around sharks, like shark infested waters, and um, you know, sh shark even the word shark attack. It pushes a negative narrative, and which is why it's better to use language like shark interaction, human wildlife interactions, because that's what it is. Sharks live in their oceans, that's their home, we enter their ocean, and so it's up to us to educate ourselves and others on shark safety. I'm from the UK originally, but I believe that when you're in school, you're taught a certain level of safety around things like using sunscreen and certain wildlife. But from my knowledge, education on ocean safety and shark safety is minimal, and so there's definitely space for this to happen. So just quickly touching on what I do currently as a scientist. So I focus mainly on blue carbon ecosystems. So blue carbon ecosystems are seagrass, mangroves, and salt marsh, and to a certain extent, kelp as well. And so blue carbon ecosystems are really, really important, especially now, because what they do is they sequester CO2 from the atmosphere and lock it away, whether that's in plants, in soil, um, and that helps deal with the emissions that we as humans are putting out into the atmosphere. And so these are just a few photos of the work I've been doing within my center in salt marshes and kelp forests. Um, for those that don't know, blue carbon ecosystems sequester more carbon than rainforests, than terrestrial forests, but they take up a percentage of the footprint. So in a smaller space on the planet, these ecosystems store and lock away carbon much greater than our traditional rainforests or forests or temperate forests. And so what do I do specifically? So I look at kelp forests and macroalgal forests and the issues surrounding them. So I specifically look at how sea urchins are impacting our kelp forests in Australia. Just a bit of background. You'll have a healthy kelp forest, which is full of varied seaweeds. We've got the giant kelp in Tasmania. And sea urchins exist in these ecosystems, but what there is as well is they're predators. So we've got the blue groper here, we've got Port Jackson sharks, we've got rock lobsters that all predate on these sea urchins, and they keep everything in check. They make sure that this ecosystem is stable. But due to the issues I mentioned earlier, with climate change and with things like sea surface temperatures and nutrients, and overfishing, you see what's called a regime shift. You remove something like a top predator, and everything else underneath it starts to blow out of proportion. And so, we're losing our predators that predate on sea urchins. Which allows their populations to boom. We're getting increased nutrients, increased sea surface temperatures, which is helping with the spawning of sea urchins. Sea urchins tend to have like a boom bust lifestyle, which means that they'll populations will boom and then they'll collapse. But because we've disrupted the ecosystem, sea urchins are just out of control in a lot of parts of Victoria. And so this very bottom image is kind of what we're seeing in a lot of areas in Australia, specifically around East Gippsland, which is my focus area. And so we've gone from something that looks like this on the left-hand side, like a good healthy kelp forest, to this urchin barren here. And so there's many ways you can deal with this. You can cull sea urchins. There's a fishery forum. And what you need to do is reduce down those numbers of sea urchins to allow the kelp to grow back. It's quite hard for me because obviously I'm not one for killing animals, but the problem is that there has to be some sort of management to these to stabilize an ecosystem. And so if there's a fishery exists, and the urchins are used, not just another method of culling is just to crush them basically and let the fish eat them. And so it's finding a way which is beneficial for those involved, but also protecting the ecosystem. So what I'm doing is kind of looking how urchins are impacting our kelp forests and what we can do to basically restore the balance in these ecosystems, and allow the kelp to come back and start storing that carbon. But also, they are important for fish nurseries. They protect our coasts through things like wave attenuation, and they're great for tourism as well. So that's a little bit about what I do. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit about, uh, the state of our oceans and, why is youth engagement and just engagement in general important for protecting our oceans, and, speaking up against these issues. And there's a lot of things I've talked about here, and I've been at a marine biology conference in Melbourne today, and obviously there's a lot of negativity as well as positivity. And just the current state of the world, sometimes you feel like all hope is lost. I know that I certainly do from time to time. But, you know, you need to think of all the positives and act on them. So, is there hope? Um, Absolutely. Like, I definitely feel like we have hope to reverse all of the damage that we're doing and restore and protect our oceans. So, how do we do this? Why? When do we do this? Well, now's the time to do it. We're actually in the UN Ocean Decade. So, from 2021 to 2030, the United Nations have deemed this period of time the time of the Ocean Decade, the time of our oceans. And it's an opportunity for us to act to protect and restore the oceans around the world. So how do we do this? Well, there's a few things I've highlighted here. And why do we do this? So, oceans affect everyone. Whether you live on the coast or you're completely landlocked, the ocean has some sort of effect on you as an individual. 50% of the oxygen you breathe comes from our oceans. But they help regulate our climate, they provide food, and they support biodiversity and our economies as well. Um, and they sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So, um, why do we do this? Why is it important to speak up for our oceans and advocate for protecting them through things like the UN Ocean High Seas Treaty. Um, well, one thing is that education translates to stewardship. So, you know, everyone who understands how important our oceans are is more likely to want to act to protect them. Um, but this knowledge is power. And so understanding how our oceans work and why they're important leads to more sustainable choices that we make in our everyday life. That helps scientists like myself obtain funding because governments are more willing to input and invest money into ocean conservation because, their nations are calling for it. And by doing that, that increases scientific information, which then leads to further research and further discoveries on how to protect our ocean. Um, Also, by doing this, you're setting an example, normalizing ocean positivity. And if you're aware of what's going on and you speak up for it, then if every single person did a little bit, that turns into a massive collective change for our oceans. And specifically because I'm talking to young AJP members, um, you are the future of our ocean protection. You are the people that will step up and take lead and take charge of advocating for our oceans through all of the methodologies and opportunities we have on hand. And so, you can be creative with how you speak for our oceans. You can have conversations, you can use social media, um, whatever it may be. Um, the youth are the future of our oceans, and I know this because there's been studies. These are just who I picked out that have basically focused on um, young people today, how they view their ocean, um, how they feel about climate change, what they want to do about it, and basically the science is saying that the younger generations today have the power and the knowledge to do something about it. And so we should listen. We should listen to what they have to say. Um, there's an organization here, the Ocean Foundation. They've created a youth ocean action toolkit, which gives you the power, the tools through a booklet on how to effectively take action. Um, and so, like I said, through social media, through documentaries, you have the opportunity to, create a narrative on how you think protecting our oceans should be done, why it should be done, and when it should be done. It's important to remember, and I think a lot of you feel the same way, that we are part of nature. We're not above it. We're not in control of it. Humanity is one tiny slice of the natural world. And so as soon as we start to realize that, we understand that, we need to, our planet is finite. It's not infinite. Our resources will run out if we're not careful. Um, and something that I like to think of when it comes to our oceans, or with our planet as well, but is that, we are custodians of the planet. We are custodians of our oceans. Um, we don't own it effectively. There's a lot of people that say we borrow it from our children. The actions that we take today um, impact the futures of those that come after us. And so it's important that we do all that we can now to benefit those after us. Um, and I just wanted to quickly finish on a few quotes um, which come to mind about our oceans and why it's important. Um, you'll recognize a few names there. There's one I've highlighted and read, which I think is a really important part to touch on. So, for those who don't know, Alfred Russel Wallace thought of the theory of evolution through natural selection at the same time as Charles Darwin. Um, Charles Darwin, famously on the Beagle and the Galapagos. Alfred Russel Wallace was in Malaysia, and independently, they both came up with the theory of evolution through natural selection. When the theory first came out in the 1800s, it was actually called the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. But unfortunately, because Darwin was wealthy, he was privately educated, he was well respected, and Wallace was just a random worker from Wales in the UK. That his name slowly fell off the theory of evolution, and it's now just referred to as the Darwin theory of evolution. But Wallace was in Singapore in the 1850s and observed the destruction of the rainforests. And this is a quote that he said in his book, The Malay Archipelago, in 1854. So, we as humanity have been impacting our planet for hundreds of years. And so, it's about time that the tables turned and we started advocating for, protecting our planet, protecting our oceans. So I'm going to stop rambling on now, and I'm just basically going to open up this for anyone to have comments or conversations or questions. If you want to follow my work, you can scan these QR codes. Feel free to reach out to me with any emails if you have any questions about anything. I just wanted to quickly brush over some of the subjects and just allow you to ask questions or talk about it. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. I feel very inspired after listening to you speak. That was amazing. Thank you. Did anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? Iris, or you're doing clapping?
I'm is my thing on? There we go. Yes. Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I have one slightly longer question, so I'll go with that. What is the rationale for shark nets? So, you mentioned that they basically don't cover very much of the sort of water space, and obviously they get a lot of other animals as well. Like what I've sort of heard about this is they're not really very effective. Um, and you also mentioned that people, I don't know if it's generally or just like a large minority are like against it. So why is it that they, exist? Like why are governments implementing them? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, it's political. It is basically the easiest way to say this. The there's been so many scientists or NGOs that have approached government um, advocating for the removal of shark nets in favor of alternatives. It's not even just a case of, hey, get rid of these shark nets and drum lines, stop doing it. The people have approached government and said, hey, we have this other solution for you. This is going to be more effective. Even if you create a net that, goes from beach out to the ocean and back to the beach, it's almost creating a pen. There's been all of this evidence and these efforts to remove these devices, and for some reason, the governments refuse to act on it, whilst pushing the narrative of bather protection. Um, if I had an answer as to why the governments do it, I would tell you, but in all honesty, I don't know. And it's like, like I said, the Queensland government have just upped the ante with their shark culling efforts. After years and years of opposition and scientific publications coming out and, nothing really changing, they're still wanting to go ahead with it. And the way that they see it is that, oh, well, no one's died from a shark interaction recently, or the numbers are very, very low, so the nets must be working. That's not the case. The nets don't do anything. A shark can swim under, it can swim over, it can swim around it. Effectively, if you want to argue the case, shark nets and drum lines can make things worse because you imagine a dolphin or a fish gets caught in a net. It's effectively luring something bigger into it, and there's been I've looked through all the images through Freedom of Information Acts from Queensland and New South Wales governments on, the wildlife that's been pulled onto their vessels from the nets. And the amount of like half-eaten sharks, half-eaten dolphins that are there, it's a clear sign that these nets are luring even bigger sharks closer to the coast. And like they sit 500 meters offshore. So like, you could be sitting on the beach in the Gold Coast or Brisbane, and you can see the buoys floating in the water. Like they're not doing anything. But yeah, the government's pushed this as bather safety. That's exactly why. We're doing this for the general public. You know, very minimal people have died over the years. Clearly, these things are working. Look at all these sharks that we're killing. You know, we're obviously being effective, but it's not. It's a fishing practice. And so, you know, the best way to find out why it's happening is to speak to those MPs that are for it, and ask them, because that's really the only way that we're going to truly know what's going on. Um, there was a great comment mentioned today, which I wanted to raise tonight, is that, you know, as scientists, we speak to members of parliament, you know, somewhat frequently, depending on the work that we do, whether it's through Science Meets Parliament, a massive conference that happens in Canberra, or whether it's, you know, through the work that we do. Um, and one of the scientists today said that, you know, he's approached MPs to talk about issues, and the MPs are completely on board, with the conversation and narrative. So, for example, we'll use shark culling. You know, you could go to your MP and say, you know, I'm completely against shark culling. Here is all the evidence to prove that it doesn't work. MPs say things like, I completely agree with what you're saying, but I'm not hearing it from my constitute. Like, you know, the people who are in their elected areas are not speaking up on these issues. And so, as far as the MP is concerned, it's not an issue. You know, and I think that's one of the strongest things you can do is, if you have an issue, regarding, you know, whether it's wildlife or the oceans or sharkling, whatever, it obviously speak to your MP, but get others to do the same as well. Because if you don't all collectively speak up against a certain issue, it's not going to take note. And nothing's going to happen. And I feel like that's exactly what's happened in Queensland, is that people independently and quietly disagree with it, but no one's taking action and voicing it to their MPs. Um, you know, there's campaigns like mailbox drops, and, you know, everyone writes something to their MP. Um, you know, studies have shown that that stuff isn't super effective. It needs to be a constant pressure on these members of parliament to keep it in the forefront of their minds, because, you know, MPs have one KPI, and that's to appeal to those in their electorate. And so, you know, if you've got something like, oh, my Woolly supermarket is increasing the prices too much, is over shark culling, then obviously the MPs are going to act on that. So, yeah, one of the issues is that, you know, I don't feel enough people are talking on these issues. And I also feel like we're in a bubble, right? You know, we're all like-minded people. You know, we all care about our planet, our ocean, you know, animals. And so we kind of get trapped in this little narrative that we all sit in, where we feel like everyone feels the same way. But once you step outside of that bubble, you realize that there's so many people out there that don't take action that potentially could. And so it's the conversations with them that we need to have to help bring things like shark culling to an end. But yeah, in regards to your question as to why it's happening, I don't know. It's purely politics.
Thanks.
Iris, did you have a question? We can't hear you. Alana, we'll let Iris fix their tech issue.
Hey, I have a theory just on what Kramer was saying. Sorry, you're on my laptop, so you're down there. Hello, thank you for coming, Chris. My theory is, so I used to live on the Gold Coast, in Currumbin, and there's bull sharks in the canals, and there's a lot of fear within the community, like, oh, don't go swimming in the canals. There's bull sharks, bull sharks, bull sharks. And so my theory is that if they've got shark nets and somebody does get attacked, well, it looks like they're at least doing something, because I feel like the noise is a lot louder when something goes wrong compared to, like, if somebody were to get attacked, there's a lot of pressure put on the politicians. So I feel like the noise is a lot louder currently when something goes wrong compared to, you know, animals are getting caught in the nets. And yeah. That's my
No, that's a good theory, and it's a good point to make. I think that touches back on the lack of education that's out there. So, for example, you know, few examples why people might be, have a shark interaction. One is that, they'll go swimming at dawn or dusk. Well, they're periods when sharks are more likely to be, hunting or feeding. They'll swim, after rain or severe weather or near places where there's agricultural runoff. Or, like you said, in estuary mouths and rivers, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's great for the bull shark. Unfortunately for us who want to engage in water activities, bull sharks can sustain a certain level of fresh water. And so that's why you find them in rivers and river mouths. But, the lack of education around this makes the issue a lot worse. If we were to educate on the best times to enter our ocean. There's never going to be a period of time where you're going to avoid sharks. They're always going to be in the ocean. It's where they live. It's about being mindful about the actions that you take as an individual to minimize your interaction with a shark. And so, yeah, don't go swimming at dawn or dusk. Don't go swimming when it's raining. Don't go near an estuary mouth or a river mouth. Madison Stewart actually has a really good handbook available online about education around, using our oceans in conjunction with sharks. Also, it might be a little bit controversial, but my opinion is that people don't die from shark bites. They die from lack of effective, immediate management of the injury they've sustained. So, for example, a lack of first aid kits on beaches that are known to have sharks around them. The time that emergency help reaches them, stemming the bleeding. There's been instances where, in some cases, people who have had a shark bite, they're wearing a wetsuit, and their wetsuit is keeping their body together. It's equalizing their pressure. In the wound, but as soon as you release that, all this blood then leaves your body goes into shock, and that's when things like cardiac arrest happen. The narrative around sharks needs to be shifted. I'm not saying put all the blame on humans, but there needs to be this understanding that, there are sharks in the water. 9 times out of 10, a shark bite is mistaken identity or it's curiosity. Shark bites happen, by for example, juvenile great white sharks, are more likely to be near the coast in the open ocean because they're learning to feed. They're learning to be a great white shark, and so they need to maximize their opportunities of hunting. And so, if you're on the surface in a wetsuit on a surfboard, you're going to look like their prey. And so, these interactions happen. The first bite from a shark is always like an investigatory bite. It's never a full force bite because you'll lose limbs instantly. But it's the management of that injury kind of post shark interaction that leads to fatalities. And so if we have effective emergency care from the get-go, then we can minimize the loss of life from these shark interactions.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to ask Iris's question for them. My question was whether there was a financial interest in current methods like culling. Does anyone profit from it?
It's a great question. I don't think, I think the only things I can think that are profitable from it is the export of shark fins. I've seen images where, sharks have been landed onto government vessels and they are missing their fins. There is an import-export of shark products in Australia. And so, this would feed into that. That's the only profit that I can really think of. I don't know whether,
because it's quite expensive, isn't it? Like for the government to run it, doesn't it cost them annually quite a lot of money?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And so, I don't know whether there's any financial incentives that I'm not aware of. I can't think of any. The only thing I can think of is that you've got certain people who are in the pockets of those MPs making those decisions that are gaining something from this. Whether it's shark fishing, the shark fishing industry in Australia, feeding into the fisheries, because ultimately, That's the government body that runs culling. It's the Fisheries Department of New South Wales and Queensland. This isn't a separate body that deals just with sharks. This is the same organizational, sorry, the same government department that deals with fisheries worldwide. Sorry, fisheries overall in Australia. And so that's what I'm saying. This is a fishing practice. This is a fishing net that is used to catch marine species. Drum lines are effectively, one small segment of a long line. It's the same principle. It's a baited hook that dangles in the water designed to entice prey. I'm not aware of any financial incentives other than this guise of bather protection. And whether they're getting incentives from those that interact with water use, I don't know. But the Australian government is a very strange government in my opinion, and there's a lot of things that happen within it that are quite questionable. For example, here in Victoria, we still have duck shooting. Why do we still have duck shooting? Well, it's because the Fishers and Shooters Party are in the pockets of the Labour Party, and so to appease both parties, duck shooting continues here in Victoria because, well, they're receiving support and funding from a political party that wants to have duck shooting. I assume something similar happens in New South Wales and Queensland. But obviously, they're not going to be open about it because that's just going to create issues. And so, there's a lot of things that happen behind closed doors. Like I said, the images that come from the boats, the government boats, the fisheries boats, when they bring the animals on board, you have to get them through freedom of information. It's quite difficult to do, and it's a pain in the backside. The data that's available on the sharks that they have captured and released during their culling methods is an absolute mess. As part of my work previously at my old university, I looked at the number and species of sharks caught and killed off the coast of New South Wales and Queensland compared to the populations in that area, and to see if there's any correlation between, well, if there's a bigger population, say Brisbane, well, hypothetically, you're going to have more sharks caught because if it's for bather protection, you're going to have more protection for a bigger population. But that doesn't exist. There's no correlation between those two things. You've got people on land and you've got sharks being caught in the ocean, and none of it matches up. So in answer to your question, I have no idea why this is going on, if there's any incentives. The only one I can think of is that, it contributes to beta protection, and, there's the finning industry as well.
Jess, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. As someone who's like a film buff, I've always thought that media has a very strong impact on how people perceive sharks with films like Jaws and whatnot. I always believed that that was sort of a main catalyst for things like shark culling. But when you told us that, it started in like the 1930s and the 1960s before films like Jaws came out, I was just wondering sort of what did you think sort of created this fear surrounding sharks?
Oh, that's such a good question. I love that question.
Yeah. I guess, it started, in the 30s, probably as bather protection. One thing to bear in mind is that, we now exist in a world where something called a shifting baseline exists. So, for example, what you consider as a healthy coral reef to your grandparents is probably quite, degraded. And so, it'd be the same with sharks. Right now we think there's X amount of sharks in the ocean. That is our current baseline. But that has shifted from the 1930s because, we're killing 274,000 sharks a day globally. So, we've eradicated, almost, 90 something percent of shark populations around the world. And so I can only imagine back in the 1930s, there were a lot more sharks. And so it might have originated from this, we need to protect beachgoers. But, that was the 1930s. That's almost, it's almost 90 years ago. Sorry, 100 years ago. But what has definitely made this worse is things like Jaws. In fact, Steven Spielberg has actively said on record, if he knew the impact that Jaws would have had on sharks, he wouldn't have made it. it is things like it's the way the media speak. It's social media. It's movies like Sharknado, which is just a bizarre movie. But these things exist and they create fear through without being horrible, through lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. Um, you know, shark, imagery and education is amazing. And a shark film can be good. Like Jaws is a great story, a great novel. But, unfortunately, it portrayed sharks in a negative light. And so now we're having to do all this work to undo it. But when you have media like Channel 9, Channel 10, Channel 7, spinning things like shark infestation and shark attack and all these terminologies, all it's doing is instilling fear in those that's listening. And so you have a negative perception. And so, we need to change the narrative. I feel like if you look on YouTube, there's a great video of like it's a black and white. I think it's like a Navy or an RAF video on how to deter sharks if you crashed into the ocean during the war, and it's super old school. Like one of the methods of scaring away a shark is screaming underwater. Like that's the education they were given back then. But that was then, and this is now, and we know better. But like I said, we continue to do this with sharks. Um, and so, yeah, so media is a massive, massive issue. And there are so many people, who work in Envoy, in the Australian Marine Conservation Society, Humane League, that are constantly pointing out media about the language and the terminology they used. I have friends that will call out news reporters who post an image of an actual fishing net and not a shark net because it's misleading. And so they need to be corrected. And so that's an attitude we need to take with not just the media, but people around us, the conversations that we have, is that, we need to spin this away from negativity. It's not the sharks' fault that they're doing what they're doing. It's how they've been for millions of years. Sharks existed before trees. Who are we to say that they're in the wrong place? They were here first, and we need to respect that.
I love that. And I love what you said about Jaws being a good novel. It's actually my favorite book. And I only read it like last year or the year before. And it's so much more than about the shark. Like when you actually read it, it's very juicy. I recommend everyone reads Jaws. Okay, I'm just conscious of time. We'll do one more question, which is also from Iris, and I love ending on this question. Young AJP is a small group, and most of us don't live in coastal electorates, but do you have any recommendations for how we might try to make a difference? And I also am just going to tack on a little bit on this question as well, but do you have any ideas of how we as young AJP can make a difference as well? Because we have our committee, we've got our members. What kind of things would you, I guess, love to see from a bunch of young people?
When you say make a difference, are you talking about just like for the planet or for oceans or for sharks? I mean, in all honesty, it doesn't matter. Like, no matter what you do, I think it's important to remember that, and this is what I'm saying, this is what I said earlier about is there hope? Yes, there is. Because I think, even I do it myself. We sit there and we think, how am I going to change the world? What I'm doing clearly isn't making a difference. But ultimately, rather than putting all the pressure onto yourself and trying to do as much as you can to make change, just do something. Something is better than nothing. Because if you all collectively did something really small, that's massive if you put it all together. And so, it's a funny thing I can think of, but it's a great example, is that Elon Musk and Tesla, right? Like the guy is, in my opinion, anyway. But the social media around Tesla when he was doing the things he was doing around the US presidency, Tesla stocks crashed. And that's just because people changed the narrative and stopped investing in Tesla, buying Teslas. People were selling their cars. Everyone did something small, but globally that had a massive impact on a certain cause. Reverse that in a positive spin, whether it's, you make more sustainable choices if you consume fish, if you, use a reusable cup or recycle or pick up 5 pieces of litter a day or have a conversation with someone. It doesn't feel like much, but collectively with everyone doing something, that amasses to something great. And so I think it's very important that you take the pressure off yourself as an individual and just do what you can. Like there's no rule as to how much you should be doing, as long as something is being done. The things like Earth Hour, that happen once a year and everyone turns their lights off for an hour and then we've done great things. Like that's amazing, but implement something like that in just your daily routine. I'm not saying you have to sit in darkness for an hour, but just think of the choices that you make on a daily basis. Whether it's if you consume animals, whether it's you go meat free one day a week, because that one small effort saves X amount of water, it saves X amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and all you've done is just made a small choice for, a couple of hours of your life. And so doing those little things can be super effective. In relation to specific issues, talk to your local MP. Get others to talk to your local MP. Correct people when they say something which you don't agree with. And obviously do it politely. But, if people start talking about shark-infested waters, you just stop them and correct them and, have a conversation about it. I think the way that you approach these things can have a massive impact. And one thing that, I use an example for this is that you have vegan activists around the world that act in certain levels of activism, and there's that extreme level. And again, this is my personal opinion, but you have those people that storm restaurants and yell at people who are consuming animals. All that's doing is putting people on the back foot and pissing them off. That's not going to create change. Because imagine you're sitting there at a table and you know no better, right? This is the life you've always lived. And someone comes in and starts screaming in your face. And I think this is why terms like vegan have become have a negative narrative, because the actions of some, then everyone's get tainted with the same brush, right? Um, and so, if you have conversations with people about things and allow for a healthy discussion, more people are more likely to change their mindsets. Something I've learned in my life is that you're more effective in a suit than you are a balaclava. Because, there's been things in my life where I've done activism, I've been more aggressive, and all I've done is annoyed people and spun a negative light on the cause that I'm trying to achieve. But there's been times where I've had conversations with people, wearing a suit or in a conference or a meeting. You change mindsets because you're having a healthy discussion. And so, talking to those around you, the way that you talk to them about an issue that you're passionate about, allow for that healthy discussion, correct where it needs correcting, see their side of it, and, have a discussion on how they feel like that. I used to work for Animals Australia, and I used to have conversations with people who are cattle farmers and sheep farmers, and Animals Australia were trying to end live export. And I'd get phone calls from people who are farmers yelling at me why I'm trying to ruin their lives. And we're not trying to ruin their lives, we're trying to improve a situation. But from their point of view, they're like fifth generation farmer. All they've ever known is farming. All they've ever known is live export. And to them, it looks like you're trying to attack them personally, attack their livelihood. And, they get very angry about it. But if you have a discussion with them and, offer, alternative outcomes, alternative industries, different ways of thinking, people are more likely to listen and take on board what you're saying. And so the conversations that you have with your MP or with the people around you, just be mindful about how you talk about these things and how you come across, and also take on their opinion, listen to what they have to say, agree where things need agreeing and disagree in a healthy way, because that's the only way that we're going to create change. If we're constantly butting heads with each other, we're not going to get anywhere. But, they say, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer, work with that narrative. And we'll get somewhere. We already are. But it's the younger generations, as you put it, that are the hope. So, it's going to be your planet after mine, after my parents, after my grandparents. my goal in life is to leave this planet a little bit better than when I found it. And I hope that everyone else does the same thing after me so that, we're creating a planet which, I enjoy today, that you get to enjoy tomorrow, and your kids enjoy after that. I want, my grandkids to enjoy sharks as I've enjoyed them today. And hopefully they get to, you know, show their grandkids just how good our oceans are because we're working with our small little choices in life to create a big global effort.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to stop our recording.